Thanks for tuning in to the mental health training. Very sorry, but we missed the first few minutes. We were not quite set up to go, and we had a few little technical issues, low volume. We'll try to fix that here. But Steve and Lisa took about an hour to go through, talk through a mental health awareness inventory quiz that we all took, and I'll upload that to the same place, and you can follow through along those questions, and they share a little bit about their personal journey just to get us started, but we'll continue to improve the quality of these for future weeks. Thanks for joining in. We'll pick it up right here. First, we're just talking about the idea that people with mental illness are really able to solve that themselves, or it's some kind of simply like spiritual warfare issue they can pray their way out of. So we'll pick it up right here mid-conversation.
That, mental illness is a sign of mental weakness, and it's a personality flaw. If that person simply wanted to do life differently, if they had a more positive attitude, they'd snap out of it, right? I didn't think I thought that, but my actions and my heart, kind of knew that way, because it felt easier, and that's just not true. It's just not true. Again, mental illness is due to moral failure and spiritual inadequacy, and that's where, we get into so much to move into the realm of sin and spiritual inadequacy, what demons are, occupying space in this person, and it's just not true. It might be part of the story, but it's nowhere even close to the whole story. And then this one is a big one that we know in our culture that we deal with right now, is the idea that people who live with mental illness are more prone to be violent. And that is not true. People are more likely to experience violence because they're vulnerable and they can't really advocate for themselves. So those are all things that I've come to accept that are part of my tendency, my lean to, and something I really intentionally need to move away from. So here we want to, we know how Jesus would respond to the people who live with mental illness and their families. He would love them, welcome them, live into their core longings with them. And that's what we are so excited to be here to, educate and help our church move in that direction. So, and that's the big overarching aim of this time together, as Steve said, learning better how to love families and people who live with mental illness, whatever shape it takes. So, but specifically, we know that education is so important, and it's not been available, within the church. We are shocked. We do a NAMI class where families and friends of people who live with mental illness come, and it's like, in our experience it's like an open door, like, oh, this is where I can be understood. Oh, this is where I can get, some answers and some support that I just, we never knew before. So education is huge, and just learning strategies, like how do you want to develop a foundation of loving families and loving people with mental illness. So learning communication skills, and we're actually going to do an empathy exercise today, which when I did that, oh my gosh, it was just very impactful. And what else are we going to do? We'll talk about specific disorders, and we'll just kind of take it as you guys have interest and as it seems important. Talking about different therapies, resources in the community, the challenges, opportunities for advocacy, all that stuff we can touch on.
Yeah, we want to make this useful for you. So we certainly have some things we want to communicate, but we also want to make this useful for you. So if you have topics or you have concerns or you have specifics that you want us to address, we'll certainly do that and be happy to do that. And, for me, the bottom line is as Lisa said, Jesus told us to love, right? And as I thought about this, I just remember looking at at Scripture and saying, what did Jesus say about this? And the first thing he said was, do unto others as you would have done to yourself, right? In other words, just treat each other the way you would want to be treated. But then he goes and raises the bar, and he says, love one another. And then one of the very last things he told his disciples is, I'm going to raise the bar again. Love each other as I've loved you. Now, that's a high bar. And it's something we all need to really take a look at. So one of the things that we just need to clarify right at the beginning is confidentiality. What we talk about here, we're going to talk, hopefully we're going to share our own experiences. We may share experiences about our loved ones. We may talk about some people within the church. There has to be confidentiality here. So what we talk about here stays here. Obviously, Jeff can be involved in this kind of core group. There may be times when something has to go another step further, but those would be exceptions, and those would have to be explicitly, talked about. So I just need to have you all kind of raise your hand and say, yeah, I'm okay with that confidentiality. Because one of the biggest issues we're going to have to deal with as we go through this is, what does confidentiality mean? If Leah has somebody in her place who's got an issue that they share with her, what does that mean to be confidential? Right? Does that mean you can't share it with anybody? It certainly means you can't bring it home, you don't bring it to Sunday morning and talk about it, but does that mean you can't bring it to Mike, or you can't bring it to Sid, or to me? We've got to be able to start clarifying some of those lines about what confidentiality means and when it comes into play. So we'll certainly address that as we go. Yeah, so we want to just tell you a little bit about us and why we're so passionate about this. By the way, we'll probably be throwing out some acronyms here and there, and if you don't know what they are, just please stop us. Like NAMI is National Alliance of Mental Illness, and it's a group that that really was a life-saving for us. We took the family-to-family class, and now we teach that class, and it's just been an amazing experience. So if we throw out an acronym that you're not familiar with, please stop us.
Yeah, so I thought by way of introduction, some of you know my story, but I would read a letter, an excerpt from a letter that I shared with the Lakeshore Regional Entity at their board meeting a few months ago. And it's a collection of all the CMHs, Community Mental Healths, and they get together and they are the body that determines funding for different programs, different allocations for the different regions, and public comment is welcome there. So there were some things I felt really strongly that I needed to let them know. So I'll just read a little bit of it, and I think you'll get the idea. My name is Lisa Tamblin Bergman, and I live at 3904 Preserve in Belmont, Michigan. I am the mother of a beautiful, smart, funny, creative, 29-year-old woman who recently learned that she lives with schizophrenia. She has lived in our home with me and my husband, Steve, her stepfather, for 4.5 years. And for 4.5 years, we've been trying to assist her as she navigates life, receiving care through the public mental health system. She is my hero. I can't believe all that she's experienced. Some of it very good, some of it really awful. I am a mental health professional, and my husband is a family practice doctor, and nothing, not our work or any of our training, could have prepared us for the agony of being a parent to a child living with a serious mental illness. Nothing. It is a school of hard knocks, to be sure. And while I'm extremely thankful for the systems we do have, I'm also desperate for systems to improve. So I go on to describe what happened to her in May of last year. She was told by one of the providers, Pine Rest and their counseling department, that they could no longer serve her because she wasn't severe enough. So they dropped her. without, they don't notify us, they don't notify anybody, just her. And so she was charged with the daunting task of finding a new psychiatrist and therapist on her own. She experienced a great deal of stress over this. She quickly, and this is the thinking disorder part, she quickly was convinced that she was going to be shut out of the system and that she was going to be homeless. And that's her biggest fear, so that she's going to be out on the streets. At some point, it made sense to her, thinking disorder again, to stop taking her medication. And Steve and I, notice very quickly when that happens, like it's no sleep, irritability, delusions, and usually it just goes into a full psychosis. And it's awful. And true to that path, that's what happened with my daughter May. So my heart goes out to people who don't, we have resources, so we were able to bring in a therapist who would work with her. But my heart just goes out to people who don't have those resources or the awareness, and that's just, part of why we're so passionate about getting this information out, especially to churches. I was listening to Kay Warren, who's become such an advocate for mental health at a Saddleback church, and she said, the church is the only place where it's mandated to love people well who live with mental illness. Governments aren't mandated, healthcare systems aren't mandated. It's here in the church. So how do we do that better?
You done? Aside from going through that with Lisa, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about my experience. I was raised in the church, fairly conservative church. After 4 years of having a single mom, my mom remarried and changed my name legally and so on, so we all had the same name. But my brothers were blonde-haired, blue-eyed, and so we knew we were a blended family. We just never talked about it. And as I grew up in the church, it became really the center of my existence. Back in those days, we went to church twice on Sunday, and we were at church probably 3 times a week for cadets and young people, and Bible study and catechism and all those things. We were there. That was the center of our existence. And one of the things that I remember distinctly growing up is the difficulties that my parents faced because they were both divorced and remarried. And there were some people who were very cruel about that. But mostly I remember kind of almost the hypocrisy of when I remember our organist who was there every Sunday for as long as I can remember. Literally, she was years, maybe decades, the organist, right? And then her husband leaves her, and now she can't play the organ anymore. And so she just disappears, right? And it's like, well, where's Louise? And, she's going through a divorce, so she can't play the organ anymore at church. What? 2 years later, she remarries, and the next Sunday, she's back at the organ because now she's married and in good standing. It was really, really difficult for me. And so one of the things that I vowed was that my marriage would be a good marriage and it would last forever, and I would never put my kids through that, and I'd never put myself through that. And I got, one of the things that really meant a lot to me was after getting out of medical school, I was asked to be the staff physician for the Cadet International Camporee. That was being hosted in Michigan. It's about 1,200 boys, and we built our own shelters and took over the open fire and all of that. And it became one of the spiritual, emotional, even physical highs for me. For every 3 years we would do this. And in 2000, I went on one of those camporees. I've been on 12 of them now. And in 2000, I went on a camporee. And when I came back, and I walked into the house, half the furniture was gone, and there was a note on the counter saying my wife had left, and she was going to file for divorce. I went into a major depression. Um, in church, I'd served as a deacon, chairman of the deacons, elder, all of that, and was obviously pretty well known within the church. And not one person asked me how I was doing. I went to church and I sat in the back and didn't talk to anybody. I felt like I needed to be there, and yet it was really difficult to be there. And not one person asked, how's it going? Is there anything I can do? I would sometimes cry, for half the service. I just had tears coming down my cheeks because, the message was one that was either very convicting or encouraging, and not one person would ever say. Nobody was rude to me, nobody was mean to me, nobody accused me of anything, but not one person offered support to me. And that just, that depression just escalated. And as most of you know, I ended up with an alcohol problem and ended up in treatment for depression and alcohol. And again, I was going to a different church then, and I literally disappeared because I was in inpatient treatment. I literally disappeared for 3 months. And when I came back, it was all, hey, good to see you back again. No one asked, where were you, or what was going on. And I can't tell you the pain that I felt from that, the abandonment, the isolation. And as I look back on that, I think part of that was on me, because I never asked anybody, to help. I never asked for help. But a lot of that was it was just people didn't know what to do or what to say. I remember one time, kind of in the shoe on the other foot, I remember meeting a guy, seeing a guy after church, and I knew from outside sources that his wife had filed for divorce, and one of his kids was in drug rehab at the same time, and it was really obviously a difficult time for him. And I saw him after church, and it was like, I really don't want to talk to you. I mean, this is going to be really hard. I don't know, what am I going to say? And so I just kind of sucked it up, and I said, he walked up to me and was like, hey, Nels, how's it going, man? I mean, are you okay? And he's like, yeah, I gave it all up to the Lord. And I remember breathing this sigh of relief that I wouldn't have to talk to him. I don't have to go there. I don't have to get messy. And so, as I look back on those things, and then as we experience this in our own family, the frustration of not knowing, what resources are out there, not knowing, what to do. I mean, if anybody should know what to do, it ought to be a counselor and a doctor. And we had no clue. We had no clue where to go or how to get there. So I think all of those things kind of put together in our experience with community recovery for 5 years here, the co-occurring disorders of addiction and mental health issues are so real. So real. Some people have said up to 75% co-occurring when you talk about addiction. So, for us, it's a real passion. For us, I believe, it's a call to a ministry, and so, we're very passionate about it.
Okay, so we're going to review our little assessment now as a way of starting the conversation about what mental illness is. So, why don't we just hear your voices too? Why don't you just take one and say what you think? Why don't you just read it and then
To start at number one or pick them?
just take one and then we'll just kind of move around.
Persons with mental illness could snap out of it, but they're too lazy, stubborn, immoral, etc. And I said that's false. Persons struggling with mental health issues are most likely to seek help first from a doctor. False.
Anybody have true? Where do you think they first seek help?
I don't think they're friends. Like, if I was,
within themselves.
yeah.
Anybody else have a thought?
The church.
Surprising, isn't it?
Is that true?
Yeah.
I mean, I guess some people come for prayer
I
requests and
Yeah, I was reading Gun K. Warren. I was listening to her talk. She says, 76% of American adults, affiliate with the church in one way, shape, or form with Christianity. 4% are Jewish, Muslim, or Buddhist. So that's 80% of all Americans who are connected in a faith community. That's a lot. That's most of our population. And so it makes sense that they would, feel that they can go to their pastors with whatever, the concern is. And it's an area where there's not preparation really. I mean, hopefully it's getting better, but
I would guess, the majority of those don't come presenting that as the problem.
that's probably true. And there again, there's education that anybody can have about, when there's a presenting problem, okay, let's kind of drill down and see what's really going on.
because if people are just starting to seek help from somebody, I wouldn't, from my own personal experience, I wouldn't think that they would even know that they have a mental health
Right,
issue.
that was my thought too.
Yeah, so it's usually a life situation or, what's hard and how they feel and those kinds of things. So we're not here to really diagnose, we're not going to talk a whole lot about diagnosis of specific mental illnesses, but talk about the symptoms and how people present when they have those symptoms. Okay, so, and learning how to just talk into those and be with the people to, have them feel that they're secure and loved and understood.
Will we talk about too, I think, and maybe this is just me, struggling with not getting enmeshed in people's stuff, being there for them, but being healthy about it. Is that
Yeah, and it's all tricky stuff. It's not it's not very clear. I can't tell you how many times I've goofed up with my daughter where okay, what did I say and how did I say that? And it's just part of the walk. It's okay. How about number 3?
1 of 5 people are experiencing a mental health issue right now. I said that was true.
People. And we'll talk a little bit about a continuum, but how about number 4?
Stigma is a primary reason people with mental illness do not seek help. I think that's true.
It's absolutely true. There was listening again to a podcast. There again, Kay Warren, but she said that in her work since her son died by suicide in 2013, she's been in this advocacy role, and so a lot of people talk to her. And 2 people that she really pulled out in this conversation were people who were diagnosed with cancer and lived with mental illness, and both of them said it's easier to die of cancer than to live with the stigma of a serious mental illness. Yeah, it's horrible. So we're here to do something about that. Number 6.
5.
Oh, 5, sorry.
What's your name?
That's your
sorry.
mic.
Within the church, a person with mental illness and family is treated like any other parishioners. Is false.
Yeah, we kind of touched on that earlier.
Talk about no caster.
No, but I will. I did kind of say something about that. It's just the disease. So Patrick Kennedy just came out with a quote that said, and he's very much with the national mental health groups and teaching. He's got a foundation and all kinds of stuff. And he himself lives with bipolar disorder. And he said, there's no health without mental health. And because it's the foundation, it's the place where everything comes from, and yet it is the no casserole, disease. So we, well, you would have experienced that had it been something that was well known and well understood. You would have been brought food and taken care of, and it's just something
Oh, yeah,
that's
the whole
so
church
hidden.
would rally around you if you were diagnosed with diabetes or cancer. They'd be bringing casseroles. They'd be, driving you to appointments, babysitting your kids so your spouse could go
That's a
with you.
good point.
All of that happens, and eagerly, and it's appropriate, and nothing wrong with that. But why does that not happen with mental illness? We typically say, I'm not sure I'm qualified for that, so here's a phone number for Pine Rest.
Right. Where the longing is for, connection.
Relationship.
And probably because of the stigma. I mean, do people even know when somebody's?
It's part of it.
Yeah.
But even if we did know, I would. I don't know if I bring. I mean, should bring a casserole to somebody, but like I wouldn't think of it feels so sensitive, like oh,
Yeah. But there are ways of communicating and speaking into that. You might get it wrong, it's kind of like what we do with prayer. We might get it wrong, but that person is still going to feel loved, no matter what.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I would think it actually might be similar to, with diabetes. Somebody that knows nothing about diabetes would say, I don't know if I can bring them a meal. I mean, what if I cook the wrong thing? And I think there's that feeling around mental illness, like if I say the wrong thing, I'm gonna damage them.
Yeah,
or-
that's not true.
I think the other challenge, like in our old community, there was someone who, we tried to care for who was mentally ill, and we did do the casseroles and the babysitting and bringing to appointments but the long-termness of it was just really hard for our community to sustain. It was years and years. It's not like a short-term, we'll really dive in for 6 weeks to get you through this. It was like, we're talking 6 years and longer, and so it's I think for our community, it was the burden of how do we do this long term, to pour ourselves out to that extent to help her really feel loved, but how do you keep doing it? I think that was the big challenge that was really hard for all of us.
And that's hard too for medical issues, I think about Joe Benke and his cancer and some of those issues. And, Todd and so on. Those are long-term issues. And I think what happens is when there's a crisis, we all jump back in again.
Right.
And it's not inappropriate to do that. And this can be the same thing with mental health. There are going to be times where things are really good. And we don't need to have a lot of support and a lot of driving and a lot of casseroles. But there's going to be those crises. But we need a community where we can feel free to talk about that and ask for that and to let people know there's a crisis. So it goes both ways. And that's the kind of environment we want to help to try and create, is one where people are free to say, I think I might be slipping downhill again, and then we can rally. But also we need to learn to notice when people are going down.
That's true.
Here's the next one.
6, people living with mental illness are capable of being productive members of society. So that's true.
No question. There are lots and lots of, the quote Steve read earlier, obviously our President Lincoln was an amazing example of how to be productive. And, there are tons and tons more. I mean, you have a list of all these names of these people that we'd all recognize their names. It's like, bipolar, schizophrenia, schizoaffective, just amazing. And yet, it's just becoming known that it's part of the landscape of our world and people live with.
If you Google famous people with mental illness, you'll have choices like 100 people, 300 people, 500 people. There's just amazing lists of names of just incredibly productive, talented, creative people.
How about number
7. Churches are not called to engage in mental health concerns, said Falls.
Yeah, we kind of touched on that. It's our mandate, really, to do that. So, and when engaging someone with depression, it is best to try to talk them into being more positive. Yes. I know that's false, But when I'm talking to somebody who's really down, that's where I go. You know, my mother raised me well to be very positive, and that's just, there's a way to engage people when they're sad, and it isn't by saying, you know, well, look at the bright side, look at this, look at that, and it tends to become more shaming than anything else.
Yeah.
Okay.
Schizophrenia is one of the most common mental disorders, and that's actually false. It's not real common. There are a number of related conditions, and even when you add them all together, depression and anxiety and bipolar are much more common than schizophrenia. So, it's kind of the one that it's almost like the hallmark, you know. It's like what do we think of when we think of mental illness? We think of schizophrenia. We don't think necessarily about an anxiety disorder or an OCD, depression. It's kind of like we always go right to the worst. But they're not. It's not that common.
People with mental illness usually come from dysfunctional families, and I'm glad I get to read this question because I think I know what the right answer is. From my personal experience, I said true because I feel like the majority of people I know with mental illness, myself included, came from dysfunction, and like which came first, the chicken or the egg? Your abuse and neglect, or you're going to have mental illness if you weren't abused and or neglected? You know, I don't know. So, but I would love to hear what.
Yeah, well, you know, if research can be trusted, it's not true. That mental illness is a equal opportunity illness, you know, and so people can come from great, solid, you know, secure environments and develop mental illness.
Some mental illness develop out of like abuse or.
Yeah, I think, you know, I think what they say is that they're, if somebody is predisposed to a mental illness, the stresses of life, you know, being in solitary confinement in prison, you know, would trigger it for sure. So,
That makes sense.
yeah. So it's a mixed bag, but you know, we need to get away from, oh, that person must have grown up in a crappy family. You know, there must be drug abuse in that family. Maybe that's true, and maybe it goes back to, you know, the generational stuff and ways of dealing with stress and stuff, but it's not, you know, it's not, as we learn more about the brain and learn more about how we function, you know, that's becoming more and more clear.
Yeah.
And having said that, many mental illnesses do run in families.
Right.
And so if there is mental illness in a parent, that's probably going to cause a dysfunctional house, right? And so, I mean, there is that side of it too. If it's generational, if it's familial, there's probably be dysfunction.
There's a potential predisposition,
That makes sense.
but it's not a given. Yeah, make that assumption.
It is best not to try to reason with people having delusions, but true.
Anybody have false? Okay. So delusion, my daughter has delusions frequently. Less frequently, thankfully, but you know, she'll just get a hold of something and believe it and get stuck in that thinking. And it's best for us to either steer her into a different conversation or you know, let her be, knowing that she'll work her way out of it eventually. So that's been, you know, if we see things just amping up and stuff, we'd have a different response. But lately, it's been, they've been, you know, little cycles, and we're able to see it, and it's like, oh, something's going on there. You know, because it's, you notice it's just not, it's Becca thinking, and it can be funny and delightful sometimes. But when it's not, it's usually she's getting irritable, she's getting scared, you know, things are, you know.
Can you give like some examples or like a better definition of what delusions look like or are?
Well, we're actually going to have an exercise in that.
We will eventually, yeah.
Yeah. So it's just simply put, it's just hearing or seeing something that's not real. Right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you know, you can believe that the FBI is out in the front yard, or you can believe that if you're blonde-haired, blue-eyed, and 31, that you could never have kids. You know, where does that come from? You know.
So it's beliefs.
You know, so it's not. Yeah, I think the key there, you know, in terms of this question is, for them, it's real. For them, it's true.
Right.
And you're not going to talk somebody out of something they believe to be true. So to try and argue or to try and logic them out of that isn't going to work. And so you can either change the subject, as we often do, try and divert her to a different subject, or just acknowledge the fact that, man, that must be hard, that must be painful, that must be scary, that must be whatever, to believe that. And just acknowledge that they actually do believe it at that moment.
Thanks for asking.
Yeah, people with psychosis are more at risk of being victims of violent crime. I said true.
That's actually true. Not what our media would have you believe, but yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
That's true. You're always hearing about somebody crazy that's
Well, every time there's a mass shooting, every time there's a violent crime, the first thing the media wants to know is there's a mental illness involved. You know, they feel free to tell us that there might be, even when they don't know.
People with mental illness tend to have better outcomes if family members and friends are not critical of them. Is it true?
I feel like that's such a general thing though. Like, what does it mean to not be critical of somebody? Like, can you not be critical of somebody and still like call them up into something different or not accept their?
That's that, you know, what are they able to do and what are they not able to do? It's that dance, you know, that's just always there. Because somebody on a daily basis can present with a different issue, you know, anytime we meet. Anxiety today, depression tomorrow, emotions all out of control, you know, so asking that question, it's a good question, and it's one we have to be willing to step into, even though we might be wrong.
We're going to do some exercises on communication and that kind of thing, but, you know, if someone has a delusion, you can say, well, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. You're crazy. That's crazy. That would be a critical reaction, as opposed to, you know, that must be really scary to think that the FBI is out there, and then let them respond, and then you can respond, and eventually you can get around to, let's check it out.
Or even, you know, like with my daughter, she's very disorganized, and so her room is a mess. You know, she stays with us, her room is a mess. And I have a choice of, you know, wondering, okay, what's she capable of and what's she not capable of? And I've chosen to land in the place where I don't think she's capable of keeping her roommate, and that's okay. So, yeah. 'Cause I think being critical about it would be shaming to her, and, you know.
Yeah, I mean, you can call her a slob and try and guilt her into doing that, or have some kind of punishment if they don't do it, like you would, you know, an adolescent. But if they're not able to, it's just, that's fuel to the fire.
Yeah. Always something to work on. Where do we leave
Oh,
off?
sorry, I think it's me. Most church pastors are trained and feel qualified to minister to people with mental illness and their families. And I guess that's false.
Yeah. That's from
What I'm
2017. It's still pretty accurate, I think.
It's interesting that, you know, statistically, more people with mental illness go first to their pastor than to their physician, psychiatrist, or counselor. That's where they go first. And most pastors don't have counseling degrees and don't have experience and don't have training and how to relate to that. And so it is very frustrating on both sides.
Yeah.
But it's not that pastors don't care.
Yeah.
They do. Clearly they do. It's just, one of the things we say a lot in our training classes is you can't know what no one's ever told you.
Mm-hmm.
And no one's ever told you how to do something. You can't know how to do it.
Access to care for people living with mental illness is straightforward and simple. I said that's false.
Is it ever?
Exclamation point.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Is it ever? So we were, thanks you guys, that was a good discussion, and just a little bit of an overview of mental illness, what mental illness is, and we've touched on a lot of it, through our conversation and those questions, but it's really the foundation of everything: our thinking, our cognitive ability, our ability to be productive, our ability to have relationships and live meaningful lives. And so I really like Patrick Kennedy's quote: "Without, there is no health without mental health."
Mm.
That's a really strong statement, and I believe it's true. Somehow we've gotten into the breakup of physical health and mental health, and there should just be one. We should treat mental health in the same way. And he's been very, very much part of the parity, bringing parity to mental health and physical health, because there's not even close to parity at this time.
You know what that means?
Oh, it means that we treat mental health with the same resources as physical health. So I don't know what the percentages are, but allocation wise and resource wise, we don't give nearly as much to the mental health system.
What was his name?
Patrick Kennedy, he's Ted Kennedy's son.
Big advocate. And of course,
Yeah.
the Kennedys have long had mental illness in their family and mostly hidden it, or tried to. And
Yeah.
Patrick has just come out and very, very open about it. He's written a book or two about it. And he's mentioned his foundation.
So we know that mental health is essential for living a balanced life and being a good parent, good spouse, all of those things, just that everybody cares about. And mental illnesses, of course, interrupt all that. So it involves a significant change to our thinking, our emotions, our moods, all of that. It's just impacted. And it's a brain disorder. I know we've probably all heard that, and more research is proving that to be true. That there's something that isn't wired properly in the brain. Without question, it creates all kinds of distress. People aren't able to, if it's serious enough, people aren't able to work, aren't able to, take care of their families, aren't able to live and move and have their being in the Lord, in community. We talked about it affecting 1 in 5 adults. The serious, and that's, the depression, anxiety, whatever the general landscape is. But within that, 1 in 24 have schizophrenia. 1 in 17, it's now being published, are living with bipolar or schizophrenia. So that number's way too high. And then 1 in 12 live with a substance use disorder. So lots and lots of co-occurring. We talked about it not discriminating, where two people can come from a great home, great family, great community, and two people in that same family can experience the same stressful encounter or whatever experience and have completely different responses. One, would trigger an onset of mental illness. The other would have resilience to move through it. So those are important things to know. It takes many forms, and we've talked about mental illness being a continuum. So mental health is on a continuum, and we're stable, we're able to have relationships, we're able to work and do all the things we need to do, and we're all somewhere on the continuum because we all have bad days, But the more severe, it goes over to the other side if you're looking at a bell curve, and that kind of holds true with the way that mental illness is distributed.
So, I mean, would it be comparable then to physical illness, where like everybody gets sick from time to time?
Probably, yeah. So that 1 in 5 is like at any given point in time, somebody's living with a mental illness. It may be mild, it may be moderate, it may be chronic and severe, but it's there. And the point is, it's a big part of our world. One of the things like with with Becca and with other clients that I've come to know who live with either a mood disorder or a thinking disorder is that I can't imagine what it would be like to not be in control of your thinking. And to be with really terrifying, and to be with people, to even have a conversation with somebody where you maybe have that thought, am I making sense? Is that what I heard? Because you hear random things come out of somebody's mouth, and it's terrifying. So, having compassion and empathy for that reality is really, really important, and heartbreaking to realize that that's what they're living with. The good news is that mental illnesses are very treatable, and this is part of that process, getting education and learning better ways of communicating with people with lived experience, and the medications that they're coming out with, the way that they're able to bring things together. My daughter's always tweaking her medications, which is probably not a good thing necessarily, but that's the reality within the world of psychiatry, is they're always tweaking, coming up with different cocktails and different blends of psychiatric meds. So it is treatable. Lots of people live with, are able to work and function, and yet there's still this shame about it. And there's a quote. This is a guy, where I worked, he says, if you had a heart problem, this kind of goes to what we were talking about earlier, or cancer, you'd never find a more sympathetic, supported group of people. But for years, I had to be secretive about my mental illness because I was in control of millions of dollars of the corporation's assets. And I couldn't run the risk of having my judgment mistrusted. So here's a guy, calls in sick because he's having a bad day, can't let anybody know what's really going on. And he's in charge of millions and millions of dollars. And that was publishing executive Paul Gottlieb. So it's important too to know what mental illness is not. And we make this a strong point to let people know that mental illnesses are not anyone's fault. We love to blame people for whatever is going wrong with others. It wasn't that long ago that schizophrenia was thought to be the mother's fault, that it was poor mothering. That wasn't that long ago. Yeah, so that's a reality, again, one of those, I don't really think it, but you really do. It's not caused by poor parenting, it's not a weak character. It's also not hopeless. I think it's really, really important for anybody who loves and supports a person with mental illness to just be hopeful. There have been times in our lives where it just, that hopelessness wants to drag us down and say, well, this is as good as it's going to get, this is the way it's going to be. And that's not helpful. I can be there and realize that I'm having that feeling, but it's not helpful for me to stay there. And, there are therapists that work with these dear ones who help them regain their hope. Because Becca kind of fluctuates from despair to hopefulness. And That's
As do
where
her
she's
parents.
at.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yeah. But it's not hopeless. There are challenges, and help is available. And we want to help make that navigation process of getting help more better known and better practiced. Mental illness is, let's see, there were a couple more. Yeah. Well, the reality is, and we've talked about this with Steve's sharing about his situation, is that, more often than not, people who live with or families who love people with mental illness end up in isolation and despair.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the last thing the church wants. And that's the place where so many people experience it. Why is that? How do we change that? We can, and we're so excited to be part of this process that we can participate as Vineyard North, figures out practices that will be more welcoming and supportive for those living with mental illness. Because that's the tendency. That's why people leave. Why, they aren't around for a while. So, how do we do that? And this education is such a huge part of the process.
So would you say, is there a one sentence definition you would give mental illness, or that is given? We talked about a lot of features, but
I think a one quick sentence response is that involves significant changes in thinking, emotion, and or behavior. So just thinking, acting, doing, or thinking, feeling, doing. Those three words: thinking, feeling, doing.
And I think part of the confusion that we have, that many of us have about mental illness, is the sense that, well, I get sad too. I pull out of it. I exercise more, or I talk to my therapist, or whatever. I get sad too. And the part of the definition of any mental illness is that it affects your functioning. Maybe at work, maybe at home, whatever, but it definitely has a significant impact on the way you function. So I can be sad and still go to work every day and still be productive and still be a good father. And sometimes it's appropriate to be sad, right? But when it lasts a certain length of time, and there are clinical definitions for all of this, but when it lasts longer than would be expected, or when it starts to affect my ability to work, to play, to parent, or whatever, that's when it becomes.
that's one of the ways I felt like the stats are both helpful and unhelpful. Where I think, having dealt with mild depression, I assumed that I could relate to, or I understood major clinical depression. It wasn't until reading that Catherine McCree book and hearing her describe, just being in a state where, death seemed like such a relief, and just the weight of her existence was too crushing to take. And some of the descriptions she got, I've never experienced anything like that. I wouldn't even want to compare it or even use the same term.
Right.
So as far as defining it, is there I hear mental illness versus personality disorder get thrown around? Are those clear categories, or is that just?
I don't think anything
Okay.
in the DSM is really a clear category, because again,
There's so much overlap.
There's so much overlap.
So you might use major mental illness versus mild illness. Or
Yeah.
Is that
Yeah, that's
a
fair.
way of talking about the different?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
parts of the
we've
spectrum?
decided to really talk about features, that are going to be common, and because you guys aren't. Nobody within the church is likely going to be diagnosing anybody.
I can diagnose everybody. That's what I gotta work on. Being honest.
I get it.
That's right. I can tell you exactly what's wrong with
Yeah.
you.
Maybe not diagnosing, but
So, Mike, I
we
think
might be
oh,
helping people realize that they need to go get mental illness help, right?
exactly.
Mhm.
Exactly.
Identifying with
Yeah.
like you said.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
We, you know, in the labels of schizophrenia, schizoaffective, bipolar with psychosis, those are all for billing. Those are for
Yeah,
insurance
that's
companies,
huge.
realistically.
Right.
The treatment is based on features and symptoms.
Yeah.
And so
that makes sense.
there's so much overlap
Mhm.
of, when I used to lecture to the house staff at the hospital, I had this big chart of all these different symptoms and all these interlocking circles of, there were only about 12 symptoms, but there were about 20 diagnoses.
Mhm.
And,
Yeah,
um,
combinations. And,
yeah.
well, the same
And
thing
so-
with like special needs, you know,
Yeah.
like you want to label it cerebral palsy, it might actually be a mix of autism and cerebral
right.
palsy and like a few, like it's just not clear
Right.
cut.
So we're all on this
Yeah.
continuum someplace.
Yeah,
yeah,
To
right.
the very worst out here. And Mike was describing that author who in her book said, every breath I took hurt. It was painful. Take a breath. And that's how deep into depression she was. And that's why you get to that, sometimes you get to those points of, why would anyone even consider suicide? When every single breath you take is painful, you get to a point eventually of despair.
Yeah.
And the lesser of two evils.
And being with people, I mean, that's a reality that we all might be invited into someday, to be with somebody who's in that deep, dark place.
Yeah.
And how do you, one of the big conversations we want to talk about is the reality that they might be contemplating suicide and have a plan. And how are we able to talk with people and be okay with that? Because I don't know about you, but when I first would hear that word suicide, thinking about suicide even as a professional, it's like, I don't want to go there, but that we need to because it's a real feeling. I'd rather be somewhere else. I'd rather be gone from here. This is too much. I can't do it anymore.
Yeah, this probably could have talked a bit about Catherine Beaver Creek. She was like, I found her first as a theologian that I was reading for a class, and then I just happened to see her name on this book.
Darkness is my only companion.
Yeah, and I was like, is that the same author? And I thought, there's no way this brilliant theologian could be bipolar. Like, I just did not add up. But I just finished a really long, thorough biography on Paul and the Apostle Paul, and we tend to think he's like this sort of heroic overcomer because we get by the time he writes 2 Corinthians, he's like struck down but not abandoned and destroyed, and N.T. Wright just points out that the crisis that he went through, probably in jail in Ephesus, over both being desperately hungry, cold, sleepless in jail, and having this massive church conflict where the entire church in Corinth had turned against him, and when he says, I despaired even of life itself, he said we despaired. He's like, that was clearly a blunt way of saying I was in this place. If he would have come into my office, I would be calling the police. This was a bad state, and the only reason he was able to say I was struck down, but not because at some point he just thought he was utterly destroyed and gone and done for, and had no hope, which is really, I think he had chronic mental illness, we would say from that, but certainly a situational illness that was severe enough that it would scare you if you were, if you're with him or your friend, which is really, freeing to think, okay, there is hope.
No, that's one fact.
And let me add to it one other thing. Writes the timeline of how Paul wrote. He thinks that Philippians, Colossians, and Ephesians were written from that jail. Well, we know they were written from the jail cell, but they were written as his. That is Paul working. He found light in the darkness. He found hope. He found healing And Colossians, Ephesians, and Philippians are like the work that came out of that, which is really, you know, if you think of where to find hope, like this is like from the darkest of places, like.
Yeah. So what I just handed out are just some statistics. I'm not going to go through all of them. We're running a little short of time, and we definitely want to do this empathy thing. But just as Lisa said, 1 in 5 adults experience a mental illness. 43.8 million adults experience mental illness in a given year. These United States numbers. But one of the things that really struck me is that third line there, 1/2 of all chronic illnesses begin by the age of 14. 3/4 by the age of 24. When we look back at Becca's life, you know, she didn't have a serious mental illness until she was in her mid to late 20s. And yet, looking back, there were probably signs that of mental illness that no one picked up on.
And that's a regular message that we hear from families and loved ones. It's like, how did I miss this? How did I not see what was happening?
What's normal teenage behavior and rebellion, and what's mental illness, and so on. So the prevalence is there, and some of the consequences. If you look at the second page, that's for children and teens. I think that's something that we really often don't think about. We can look through that. I know you guys can all read, so I'm not going to go through all these numbers. There are some warning signs there that we'll talk about more later on. And then I just want to point out the first 2 pages. These are statistics from 2014, so 4 years ago. The second 2 pages are from 2018, and they're virtually identical. I think that's really important to understand that this is not something that's getting better.
Not really.
Yeah.
Well,
I mean,
I
really,
think you also hear that like it's getting worse, like environmental factor, like that's. Is there any conclusions on that? Like, you know, we medicate more now, but it's
really, really hard to know, Mike. I think we're better at recognizing it than we used to. So, is there more of it, or are we just seeing it more clearly? In other words, I'm more aware of it now, so I'm going to. And part of it is just a redefinition of some of these conditions. And so I always tell people, is there more autism than there used to be? Maybe. I don't know, because if I suddenly decided that anything with a wheel was a car, there'd be a whole lot more cars out there right now than there was, a minute ago. And so part of it is our definition of these conditions. And so that's a really, really hard question to answer. It's more prevalent. I think probably it is, just because there's so many more influences now, so much more stimulation from the media and from the internet and from all of that. But, yeah. All right, so we want to move on and do this. Just do this little thing. We're going to try and do some kind of a interaction at most of our sessions. So we're going to have these. We're going to divide up into 2 groups of 3, and when Natasha comes back, she can be with us. But what we're going to ask you to do is to think about. When we talk about auditory hallucinations, what does that mean when you hear voices? And again, it's kind of a spectrum. Okay, sometimes we hear people these voices are screaming at me to do these terrible things, but most of the time, I believe it's this almost like an enhanced inner dialogue of what your mind is telling you as you're trying to do other things. And so we're just going to ask you to. You're going to be with us.
Okay.
So what we're going to ask you to do is kind of spread out a little bit in 2 groups of 3. One of you will be the person who has the mental illness, and the other one is going to be like if you want to do it this way, you've got the little thing there, so you can have mental illness right now, and you're just going to have a normal conversation with Liz. But meanwhile, you are going to be whispering through this tube in her ear. We're going to give you a little script, and you're just going to be talking to her, and you're going to just kind of try to experience what it's like to have this inner conversation while you're trying to have a conversation. And you're going to try and say, like that, talk with someone who's having this go on. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
And then we're going to switch, so everybody gets a chance to do all three parts.
So
Okay.
what would my part be?
We're just going to have a normal conversation.